Hey everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Live with NORML. I'm J.M. Padini, the Development Director here at the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. It's Friday, September 19th, 2025, and today I'm going to be joined by NORML Deputy Director Paul Armentano, and we are going to talk about federal marijuana rescheduling, the potential state and federal policy impacts of a move by the federal government of marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Let's go ahead and welcome Paul.
Hello there.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Hope you've had as fantastic a week as I have this week.
No, it's been absolutely stunning. Can't say enough about it, Paul. Paul, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Before we talk about what rescheduling will do, what it might do, and what it won't do, can you give our viewers just a quick update as to where the federal government stands right now when it comes to the petition to reschedule cannabis that was initiated under the previous administration?
Sure. I'll try to make this as brief a history lesson as possible. But about 3 years ago now, in October of 2022, the Biden administration initiated a petition to reschedule the cannabis plant. Under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, there's a provision within that law that says if new science comes to light that challenges the scheduling of a particular controlled substance, then an entity can petition the Department of Health and Human Services and the DEA to revisit the scheduling of said substance and issue a review and a recommendation with respect to whether that substance should remain where it is currently scheduled. So, as everyone listening to this show knows, cannabis has been a Schedule 1 controlled substance since the passage of the CSA in 1970. There have been a number of prior rescheduling petitions that have challenged the placement of cannabis as a Schedule 1 controlled substance. NORML initiated the first ever rescheduling petition in 1972. And to give folks an idea of how long this administrative process can drag out in some circumstances, that petition was not resolved until 1994, over 2 decades after NORML filed its petition. There have been 4 additional administrative petitions that have been filed since that time. All of them have been rejected. And now we have this current petition that was initiated by the Biden administration, the first time a presidential administration had ever initiated a rescheduling petition. So the way the process works is once one files the petition, it goes to the Department of Health and Human Services. They review the petition, they review the scientific evidence that the petitioners are bringing to the table, and they make a decision of whether there is any basis for the petition to go forward. If they decide that there is, then the agency conducts its own internal review of the available science, and it looks to see if that science is supportive of the current scheduling of that substance. So because cannabis is a Schedule 1 controlled substance under the CSA, it must meet 3 distinct criteria by law. It must have no accepted medical utility in the United States. It must have the highest potential of abuse of any controlled substance, and it must be deemed to be so unsafe for human consumption that it cannot safely be dispensed even under controlled conditions, like a doctor prescribing it to a patient in a hospital. Those are the 3 conditions that by law a substance must meet to be included in Schedule 1. So what HHS did was they reviewed this petition and they said, does the current science support cannabis being in Schedule 1? Does the available science support cannabis meeting those 3 criteria? And of course, the obvious answer to anyone is no. Cannabis doesn't meet any of those criteria. That's what HHS believed as well. In fact, when they did their review, they said clearly cannabis has medical utility in the United States. Therefore, we need to assess its abuse potential, its safety profile. So then they compared cannabis to a number of different drugs, both drugs in Schedule 1, but also substances in Schedule 2, 3, and even 4. There was several parts of the HHS's review was comparing the safety of cannabis to of benzodiazepines, which is a Schedule 4 substance. They also compared cannabis to unscheduled substances like alcohol and tobacco. So after they did this review, they said, okay, the available science is clear. Cannabis doesn't belong in Schedule 1. It should be moved out of Schedule 1 and placed in a lower classification. HHS recommended Schedule 3. They then sent that recommendation to the Drug Enforcement Administration that historically has had final say on any rescheduling petition. DEA was clearly not happy that HHS reached this conclusion and that they kicked it to DEA. So DEA essentially sat on it for as long as they could until the Biden administration's former Attorney General, Merrick Garland, intervened and said the DEA doesn't seem to be moving forward with this petition. As acting Attorney General, I'm going to try to expedite the advancement of this petition. At that point, the DEA's former administrator said, we are going to use our right within this process to call for rescheduling hearings. And those hearings were set to take place before the DEA's own administrative law judge. DEA has lots of authority when it comes to these hearings. They decided when the hearings would be. They picked who the witnesses at the hearing would be, and obviously it's before their own judge. Even despite all of this, the DEA, it was determined by its own judge, was acting so egregiously and in bad faith in the days leading up to the hearing with regard to the witnesses they selected, with regard to not following the judge's rules and orders prior to the hearing, failure to file evidence by certain dates, that the judge essentially threw up his hands and said, I can't let this hearing go forward because the DEA has acted so improperly that if and when I issue a ruling, it will be appealed because the appellants will say this ruling isn't valid because the process was tainted by the way the DEA behaved. So in January, just prior to the hearing getting started, the DEA's judge said, no, there will be no hearing until the two parties get together and the DEA learns to act properly. That's why we are at the impasse we are at. Since that time, that the judge in this case is retired, so there currently is no administrative judge that's handling this case. The parties in this case have never gotten together to rectify their differences, so that impasse remains. And so what we're left with is this very unusual situation where we have the President of the United States who has essentially said, or at least implied, that he's going to step in and he's going to try to reinitiate this process and move it forward. But we don't exactly know what he means or how he intends to do that. We don't know if he intends to assign a new judge to this case and try to get the parties together to hash out their differences and then go ahead with the hearings that we were supposed to have months ago. That's one option. We don't know if he wants to bypass the DEA altogether and order his attorney general to just go straight to a final rule and publish that rule in the Federal Register and try to reclassify cannabis that way. I certainly think the president's within the authority to do that, but certainly that action would be appealed. And the appellants would likely say that the historical precedent of how this process works wasn't followed, and that would probably delay this process even longer. He could go in a totally different direction and say, I don't think marijuana belongs in Schedule 3. I'm going to recommend it go to Schedule 2 or some other classification altogether. Or he could say, you know what? I think it's marijuana scheduled right where it should be, and drop this case altogether. We don't know. And the only implications we have are from a Truth Social tweet back in November, where the president indicated at that time that he was supportive of a move of moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And then we have an off-the-cuff statement that he made at a press conference in the beginning of August, where he said this is an issue his administration's looking into, and within a couple of weeks, he would be instructing his attorney general to take up the issue. And we've heard radio silence since that time. And that is where we are now. And hopefully that gets folks up to date.
So it has been more than a few weeks since the president indicated it would be a few weeks that we would hear something. It's leaving a lot of people wondering what exactly is going on.
Yeah, and I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't predict the future. And I am not a fly on the wall in either the Attorney General's office or in the White House. So I can't speak to what's going on behind the scenes. What my intuition does tell me, however, is that when Trump made the statement about a decision will be made in a couple of weeks, this was not any sort of planned announcement or planned rollout. I don't think his attorney general in their office was probably aware he was going to say that. It was from a question from a reporter that wasn't really specific to the issue at hand at the press conference. So I tend to think the president just basically talked out of turn. And since that time, other folks in his administration are probably playing some catch up. And in the ensuing weeks, he's, I'm sure, hearing from lots of voices, both voices on the side of advancing reclassification, and he's certainly hearing from opponents on the other side who are telling him not to reclassify cannabis and to drop this issue altogether. And, you know, I dare say the president has a history of sort of acting in a manner that reflects the voices that he most recently heard in the room. So this really could come down to who some of the last folks are to talk to him before a decision is rendered. But we certainly don't have any idea what the administration is going to do or when they're going to do it. I have my presumptions as to what they're going to do and how they're going to announce it. But again, we certainly don't have any definitive timeline, and nobody other than the president and perhaps those in his inner circle really have any sense of what the president is thinking when it comes to cannabis policy. He's been sort of all over the map on this issue. And even when he said in August that his administration was going to be announcing a decision in a couple of weeks, he made it clear that he'd heard very good things about cannabis, and he'd also heard very bad things about cannabis. So again, not really giving a clear indication of what the administration is going to do. And I think that's by design.
Yeah, perhaps. Well, Paul, why don't we go ahead and get into the potential policy implications, and let's talk about what rescheduling will do.
Sure. So I think it's really important when we have this conversation that we sort of break it up and we compartmentalize it into three parts. What rescheduling will do, what it won't do, and what it might do. And when it comes to what it will do, I think we can clearly state that reclassifying cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 will be a public and formal acknowledgement from the federal government that cannabis possesses legitimate medical value in the United States. And I think that there is a lot of significance to the federal government coming out and making that admission, because it really wasn't that long ago that the federal government was actually trying to prosecute physicians who dared to speak to their patients and recommend medical cannabis as a treatment in states that allowed it. That's how hostile the federal government has been in the past to the idea of medical cannabis. So having them reverse that position and acknowledge what the majority of the public knows, what the majority of patients knows, and what the majority of scientists knows, that cannabis is a legitimate therapeutic option, I think is tremendously significant. And I hope that it helps us as a nation evolve our conversations surrounding cannabis. We also know that reclassification will eliminate some of the very significant federal tax burdens that state licensed cannabis businesses currently face. Right now, those businesses are forbidden by the federal government because of cannabis's Schedule I classification from taking even standard business deductions. This greatly increases the cost for these businesses for doing business, and those higher costs are ultimately passed on to the consumer. Ideally, by removing some of these tax burdens, we would see an environment or a climate that is better for these state licensed businesses, and ultimately we might see lower prices for cannabis consumers as a result. But right now, it is very hard for these businesses to be successful because they are literally paying a higher tax burden than any other legal businesses in this country. Ideally, that some of that goes away with reclassification.
Thanks, Paul. All right, Paul, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, great. Paul, you've said that there are a few things that rescheduling might do.
Yeah. So this is the issue that's kind of, I think, really interesting to sort of talk about, because we can't say with any certainty that many of these things would happen, but I think ultimately they would. But I don't think they'll happen right away. So for instance, right now, there are a number of federal penalties that consumers face because cannabis is a Schedule I controlled substance. For instance, as I'm sure many listeners to this show know, it is the federal government's posture is that one cannot be a cannabis consumer and legally own a firearm, because there's a 1968 federal law that says unlawful drug users cannot legally own a firearm. And the federal government has maintained that because cannabis is Schedule I, any and all use of cannabis is unlawful. I believe the federal government loses any basis for that position if cannabis is no longer Schedule I and it's moved to a lower schedule. There's a number of federal statutes like that. For instance, one is forbidden from living in public housing, and they can be thrown out of that housing if they possess a Schedule I controlled substance. The statute doesn't say if you possess cannabis or a long list of controlled substances. The statute specific to Schedule I controlled substances. So again, by removing cannabis from that classification, I think it's very likely that consumers will no longer face some of these federal penalties that are specific to the Schedule I classification of cannabis. Now, that's not to say that the federal statutes that are specific to marijuana that keep it criminalized would be changed. They wouldn't be, because those statutes are marijuana specific. but these are additional statutes that are specific to Schedule I controlled substances. And clearly cannabis would no longer apply if it's no longer Schedule I. I also think that we would, with reclassification, we'd see physicians who are part of the Veterans Administration office begin to recommend medical cannabis to their patients in jurisdictions that allow that. Right now, those physicians do not, because they're working for the federal administration, and the administration says you can't recommend medical cannabis, it's Schedule I. They don't say you can't recommend medical cannabis because it's not FDA approved. Again, the prohibition is specific to it being Schedule I. So if you remove marijuana from Schedule I believe you lift the prohibition. There also could be implications for workers' comp and insurance reimbursement. Right now, actually, in about 6 states, the courts have said that if you're injured on the job and you use medical cannabis to recover from that injury, that your insurance plan, your workers' comp plan, has to reimburse you. That might surprise some folks, but that's the law in a number of states. Now, there's also a significant number of states where the courts have looked at that same issue and said, no, your insurance provider cannot reimburse you for costs due to medical cannabis because cannabis is Schedule I. Again, that is the basis for why courts in about 7 or 8 states have said, no, there's no reimbursement here. Again, if cannabis is no longer Schedule I, the logic behind those decisions goes away. And again, I think it opens the door for things like potential reimbursement of medical marijuana from insurance providers. It's possible. I'm not as convinced as some folks are, but it's possible that moving cannabis out of Schedule I could have some impact on federal drug testing regulations that generally mandate certain federal employees and CDL licensed drivers can't have certain drugs in their system, and they're routinely tested for those drugs. I'm not convinced that moving cannabis out of Schedule I automatically triggers changes in those federal regulations. But some folks are, including the Department of Transportation, which has testified multiple times before Congress and said that they're very concerned that a move of cannabis out of Schedule I will undermine these longstanding drug testing policies. I wish I believed that were the case, but I put this in the category of there could be some implications here because that agency has been so adamant that changes would happen. And I guess the final thing I'd say is that there are a handful of states that have what are known as trigger laws on the books. These are laws that say if the federal government changes the classification of any controlled substance from one scheduling to another, that the state needs to revisit its own classification. So right now, in many states, not all, but in many states, and certainly in cannabis prohibition states, cannabis is Schedule I within their own state-specific statutes, not just by the federal law, but the states have their own controlled version of the Controlled Substances Act, and cannabis is a Schedule I drug there. There are certain states like Texas that have these trigger laws on the books that say if the federal government moves cannabis out of Schedule I, it doesn't say you as a state have to do the same, but it says as a state, you have to look into this issue and you have to consider revisiting the issue. So it's possible we could see some states at least hold hearings and consider changing their own state level classifications of cannabis if the federal government were to do so.
Well, I think now it's time to get into our absolute favorite part of this conversation, and that's what rescheduling will not do.
Yeah. This I wouldn't say this is my favorite part of the conversation, but I think it's the most important part of the conversation. Sure. Because there's a lot of misunderstanding with respect to what rescheduling would do. I'll tell you what it won't do. And we can be pretty definitive about this. What it won't do is promote states' rights. It will not empower states that either have legalized and regulated cannabis for either adult use or medical use. It will not empower them or states that want to follow suit to go ahead and do so, because reclassifying cannabis from 1 to 3 does not provide state governments with the explicit authority to set their own cannabis policies and regulatory schemes free from undue federal interference. In fact, it perpetuates the existing conflict we have right now, where a majority of states are treating cannabis under their own state laws in a manner that's inconsistent with how the federal government, through the CSA, demands that states regulate cannabis, right? The thing is, the federal government gets its power to essentially tell states what to do with respect to cannabis by the CSA. The CSA establishes a uniform set of rules, federal rules and regulations that every state must follow based on where a substance is scheduled or classified in the CSA. So under Schedule 1, there's one set of rules that every state is supposed to follow. Right now, the majority of states aren't following those rules when it comes to cannabis. But if it's moved to Schedule 3, those rules don't go away. They're simply replaced by a new set of rules that the federal government sets that all the states are supposed to follow. And right now, the 40 states that regulate medical marijuana and the 24 states that regulate adult use, they are not following the rules that are dictated for a Schedule 1 controlled substance, and they're not following the rules that are dictated for a Schedule 3 controlled substance. So it doesn't empower the states to be the leaders on this issue, and it doesn't rectify this existing state-federal conflict that exists as it pertains to cannabis regulation. It simply perpetuates it. So I would say it's a real missed opportunity to address the biggest elephant in the room, and that's the fact that the overwhelming majority of states are flouting federal law. It also doesn't do a whole lot, in my opinion, for stimulating or facilitating clinical research into cannabis. And I hear this quite a bit. They say we have to reschedule cannabis so we can study it. That's hogwash. First of all, we already have many, many clinical trials using cannabis, even though it is a Schedule 1 controlled substance. In addition, the primary hurdles that are in place that make clinical testing of cannabis, clinical studies of cannabis so difficult aren't due to its status as a Schedule 1 controlled substance, but it's due to separate statutes and separate regulations that limit how researchers can access cannabis and how the timeline with which clinical studies that wish to use cannabis, the timeline with which it takes to have those studies reviewed and accepted. So for instance, right now, if researchers want to design a study where investigators will be administering state legal cannabis products to patients or some other subjects, they can't do that. They can't do it not because cannabis is Schedule 1. They can't do it because there are separate federal regulations that say marijuana in a clinical study must come from a federally licensed source. That is a requirement that exists for cannabis, but doesn't exist for other Schedule 1 drugs. So that requirement, that impediment remains in place, even if cannabis is reclassified. And we hear from scientists all the time that say the reasons they don't do this clinical work, the reasons they don't propose these clinical trials is because they want to study the effect of cannabis that people are using in the real world. They want to study the effect of state legal cannabis products. Rescheduling cannabis doesn't allow them to do that. So it's not going to streamline that process. It's not going to make that process any easier. And it's certainly not going to facilitate funding or appropriate funding so that we can have additional clinical trials. None of those things are going to happen. The final thing I'll say, because I know this is a concern of a lot of people, is that I don't believe moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 is going to really in any way disrupt the existing state regulatory scheme. It's not going to mandate that cannabis be treated like an FDA-approved drug, which means it would only be available by prescription and it would only be distributed in pharmacies. And the reason I say that is because if you read the White House Office of Legal Counsel opinion that came out right after HHS made its recommendations, they were very clear on this. They said from a legal standpoint, HHS recommending cannabis be moved to Schedule 3 does not equate to FDA approval. FDA approval would only be, we would only have FDA approval if an entity went to the FDA with their dossier of phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, and the FDA reviewed those trials and made a decision that a specific preparation of cannabis that was used in those trials met standards of safety and efficacy for treatment of a very specific condition. If that were to happen, then that formulation would get FDA approval, and that formulation would then be available by prescription and be distributed in pharmacies. That's not what we're talking about. The White House Legal Counsel made that clear. It differentiated between an acknowledgement that cannabis has medical utility versus FDA approval. So absent FDA approval, there is no requirement that cannabis can only be legally possessed and obtained by prescription, and there's no requirement that it belongs only in pharmacies.
Yeah, so again, that FDA drug approval would be for a specific condition and a specific formulation.
Yes, and it would be based on an FDA review that would only be triggered if an entity went to FDA demanding that review and provided the safety and efficacy data through phase 3 clinical trials for the FDA to review. And there's simply no entity that has ever shown any interest in going forward with the FDA to do so.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that THC is already an approved Schedule 3 drug and available by prescription.
Correct. So in fact, there's several versions, there's several analogs of THC. So dronabinol, which is oral synthetic THC, and sesame seed oil is Schedule 3. It used to be Schedule 2. It was actually rescheduled by DEA in 1999 due to its impeccable safety profile. Nabilone is another THC like drug that is available as FDA approved. That's Schedule 2. And interestingly, Epidiolex, which is the only plant-derived cannabinoid drug to receive FDA approval, it is a largely CBD drug, is not scheduled. It is not in the CSA. It was initially scheduled by DEA as a Schedule 5 controlled substance, the most lenient category. But then after about 1 year, the DEA decided it didn't belong in the CSA at all. And like alcohol and tobacco, it is descheduled.
You know, I just wanted to make sure we were real clear on that for people who are very sure that this is going to entirely disrupt existing regulatory structures for adult use and medical cannabis in states that have taken those measures. I think we hear most frequently that people's aversion to rescheduling, other than that it is not descheduling, their problems seem to be that they think it's going to disrupt existing market structures, or that they hold the opinion, not that they're opposed to it, but they hold the opinion that it's going to improve the ability to do research or make it available by prescription.
Yeah. Let me say one other thing about the FDA as well. The FDA is an agency that right now is in rapid transition, but is arguably understaffed and is not an expeditiously moving entity. And when it comes to cannabis, this is an agency that historically has shown they have very little interest, if any interest, in playing a role in setting cannabis policy. And the example I'll give folks listening is that the 2018 Farm Bill that descheduled hemp. Okay, it didn't reschedule hemp, it descheduled hemp. It took hemp from Schedule 1 of the CSA and removed it entirely. That law, in that law, Congress authorized the FDA by statute to come up with regulations governing the manufacturing and selling of CBD products that became legal under the 2018 Farm Act. And here we are 7 years later. The FDA has never done a thing with regard to regulating CBD. They held a couple of hearings, and several years ago, they essentially went back to Congress and punted on the issue. And they said, I know you told us that we're the agency that needs to deal with this, but we don't have the capability to deal with it. We think you need to deal with it. And they kicked the issue back to Congress, and Congress has never done anything. So here's an instance where the FDA was actually instructed by law to get into the cannabis regulation business and refused to do so. And when we're talking about reclassifying cannabis, it's not even doing so, as the White House has already said, doesn't even necessarily get the FDA involved. So I don't think they're going to be proactive and try to get involved in this issue, because historically, again, they've simply shown no interest in doing so.
You know, Paul, since we're talking about what the federal government is and isn't doing in regard to cannabis, let's talk about two other topics that we get asked about a lot, and that is let's talk about DOT and the approval of oral fluid testing for commercial drivers.
So that's a great question. So again, as I'm sure most everyone listening knows, that if you're a commercially licensed driver, you are regulated by certain federal rules and regulations, including regulations that they pertain to random drug testing on the job. And so CDL licensed drivers have to routinely undergo random drug testing. Typically, that's done by urinalysis. And as most folks know, because THC is a lipid-soluble compound, both THC and its metabolite have a habit of hanging around in bodily fluids for extensive periods of time, long after any period of intoxication is worn off. And when it comes to the carboxy THC metabolite, which is an inert byproduct of THC that collects in the urine, that compound can show up on a urinalysis test for literally months after a person has stopped using cannabis. So this has been a real problem for individuals, particularly those who live in legal states, who say, well, state law says I can use cannabis, but my federal employer says I can't even be anywhere near cannabis because I'm subject to this random drug testing at any time. And you know, I might test positive because I was exposed to cannabis weeks earlier, even though it has no impact on my ability to do my job. So there's been a growing recognition among DOT that this is a problem and that the federal drug testing rules need to evolve because the political climate and the legal climate regarding cannabis has changed. So now, I dare say 18 months, nearly 2 years ago, the DOT announced that they were going to move forward with oral fluid testing as an alternative option to urinalysis. Now, saliva testing for cannabis has its own problems. It also can detect residual use of cannabis up to 48 hours or even about 5 or 7 days, depending on what the cutoff threshold is used. That's still a problem, but it is not as problematic as urine testing. So I know a lot of folks have sort of been awaiting for this change to take place. Unfortunately, it has not changed in practice. And that's because DOT says that there are no federally licensed labs that currently have the ability to accurately do saliva testing for cannabis. And until those labs come on board and get certified, there can't be any oral fluid testing under the DOT regulations. And that's where things stand.
Paul, we have a question from Quinn. Let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and see this one now. Quinn asks, what is NORML currently doing to move rescheduling forward?
Sure. That's a great question. NORML, as I said earlier, has been a party to virtually every rescheduling petition that's ever been issued, going all the way back to the early 1970s. In fact, in the 1990s, I hand-delivered a rescheduling petition to the DEA. That was in 1995. That we had filed along with Professor John Getman. So we have a long history of making it clear that cannabis doesn't belong in Schedule 1. With respect to this latest petition, we organized public comments during the DEA public comment period from numerous experts around the country to discuss the science pertaining to cannabis that made it clear it didn't belong in Schedule 1 or 2. We actually, if you looked at our public comments, we did not make a determination where cannabis did belong, but we said we agreed with HHS's recommendation that cannabis did not fit the criteria of a Schedule 1 or a Schedule 2 controlled substance. I think something like 25% of the total comments that were submitted to DEA came from NORML and our constituents. So we played a significant role in advancing that part of the process. We did file to be witnesses in the hearings that were to be scheduled. We were denied, but I personally was working with the legal counsel for a number of the plaintiffs that were going to appear at those hearings. And we continue even now. We have a petition that's on our website that you can contact the White House and tell the White House that we believe that if they want to follow through on their promise of making this a states' rights issue, then the answer isn't moving cannabis to Schedule 3, but it's treating cannabis like alcohol. And that means removing it from the CSA altogether. Last check, I think we had generated, 25,000 letters to the White House in support of that position. So this is something we've worked on quite a bit on the past, and we continue to work on today.
Yeah, in support of, Paul, it's in support of descheduling, we've generated 43,697 constituent emails to federal lawmakers. That's NORML alone, over 43,000 emails. So that's what we're doing. And then when it came specifically to the rescheduling petition, I was trying to remember the number of emails that we generated, but it was in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, like I said, I think it was roughly about 28% of the total number of emails or public comments that were sent to DEA used NORML's template. And in addition to that, like I said, we identified specific scientific experts in the field and encouraged them to send their own unique public comments. So again, we played a significant role in that part of the administrative process.
You know, Quinn follows up with this and says, but that has done little to move the needle. And I would say under this administration, perhaps, but under the Biden administration, we did see significant movement.
Yeah, and again, if we're talking about rescheduling, this is an administrative process. Okay, this is a behind the scenes bureaucratic process that has specific rules it needs to follow as specific to the statute that created the process. So again, as I explained earlier, under the statute, this is a decision that is made in concert with HHS, DEA, and the United States Attorney General that allows for public input in the public comment period and in the hearing period, if there are hearings. I didn't make the rules. Those are the rules as set by statute. This isn't something where the public ultimately gets to weigh in on outside of the opportunity for public comments or if they're selected to be witnesses in public hearings. Certainly, we can put pressure on the administration to act, and we are doing so. But again, this isn't a piece of legislation. This is an administrative bureaucratic process, a process that for 55 years has largely been set in stone. And this petition is following that process.
Sure is, just like everyone before it. Although potentially this one may not follow the same process.
Yeah. If the DEA is largely cut out of the process by the Trump administration, that would upend how this has historically happened in the past, and that would be very interesting if the administration takes that road.
Paul, I know there has been some movement regarding DEA's directive to approve additional sources of cannabis for research purposes. Can you give a little update on that?
Sure. So actually, when the prior rescheduling petition was denied by DEA in 2016, as a concession, if you will, the DEA acknowledged that it was impossible in the current regulatory environment for a private entity to do the clinical trials and procure cannabis for those clinical trials that would lead to cannabis drug development. They said, we recognize there's no pathway forward for anybody who would want to do that, because we have this requirement that cannabis that's used in clinical trials come from only one federally licensed source. And for 40 some odd years, that was the University of Mississippi. So in 2016, they said, we're going to open up this process. We are going to seek out applicants that want to obtain a federal license to grow cannabis for research purposes. And for years, nothing happened, because the same DEA that issued that edict then walked it back and said, oh, we've made a mistake. International treaties don't allow there to be more than one federally licensed source of cannabis in the United States. So we actually can't take on additional applicants. Well, a number of years went by, and eventually the DEA conceded that that wasn't the case. And in fact, they could, even under international treaty obligations, license more than one federal grower of clinical cannabis. And within the last 3 or 4 years, I believe they've licensed a total of 5 or 6 additional federally licensed growers of medical cannabis. In fact, I was at a conference earlier this week, and I was actually speaking with one of those license holders. But to date, very few clinical trials have reached out to those alternative federally licensed applicants and sought their marijuana, to use their marijuana for research purposes. For the most part, clinical trial studies still get their cannabis from the University of Mississippi.
Nice and moldy and full of yeast, straight out of the freezer.
Yes. Cannabis typically has been sitting, was freeze dried, has been sitting around for years on a shelf. Yeah,
nice low percent. Oh, great. And for those who don't know, the new head of DEA under the Trump administration is the former Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security from Virginia, Terry Cole, and he hates cannabis. He's made that abundantly clear. So he's no friend to this process in any regard. All right, friends. I know you have questions. Drop those in the comments for Paul. While we wait to see if you have any questions, we'll talk a little bit about.
I do want to say, JM, one thing again about sort of descheduling versus rescheduling, and certainly why NORML is far more supportive of descheduling, and that's because, again, it's only by descheduling that states have the ability to set their own cannabis policies. And this principle goes back now nearly 100 years, because when we look at the history of alcohol prohibition, when the federal government repealed its failed policy of federal alcohol prohibition, it did not mandate states legalize and regulate alcohol. It simply got out of the way and left it up to the individual states to decide how they wanted to regulate alcohol. Some states had already begun regulating alcohol even during federal prohibition and actually defied the federal government to do something about it, like New York. Other states waited until the federal government repealed alcohol prohibition, and then they moved right away to legalize and regulate alcohol. But some states didn't. Some states were content to keep alcohol criminalized even after the federal repeal. States like Mississippi continued to keep alcohol illegal for many, many years because it was their own decision to make, which is why we sort of have this 50-state patchwork with regard to how states regulate the production and sale of alcohol. How Connecticut regulates alcohol is very different than the way Texas regulates alcohol, which is very different than the way California regulates alcohol. The reason states have that flexibility and they don't all have to treat alcohol in exactly the same way is because alcohol is not in the CSA. And by it not being in the CSA, states can largely make their own decisions, how they treat and regulate the product within their own state borders. That's what states are already doing with cannabis. So that's why it makes so much more sense for cannabis to be removed from the CSA rather than simply move to a different schedule in the CSA, which would literally largely keep most states in the same position they're in right now. They're already flouting the rules that go with cannabis being in Schedule 1. If it's moved to Schedule 3, most states will simply be flouting those rules as well.
Exactly. Paul, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the news from this week, since we're here. This week, Minnesota, after more than 2 years after legalization, Minnesota was finally able to begin adult use sales. Like every state that has expanded from medical to adult use, their sales began at existing medical cannabis operators. Now, there were some...
Which begs the question why it took 2.5 years.
Great question. I think 18 months is generally the window that states need to ramp up, but we've seen, Maryland is a great example. They did not. They said, get ready, it's coming, and they were able to pull that trigger pretty quickly. And then we've got, Minnesota taking over 2 years, and we've got Virginia, who is over 4 years in at this point.
Yes, I was going to say that now of the 24 states that have legalized adult use cannabis possession, there is now only one state that has not rolled out a system of retail sales, and that is unfortunately your home state.
It sure is, and that's because what? Oh, that's right, friends. Elections have consequences. We have spent 4 years under the Youngkin administration, who thinks that instead of putting, cannabis behind an age-verified counter like we do for medical cannabis, instead it should just be in every gas station and smoke shop and wherever, just a free-for-all of contaminated garbage. But good news, Virginians, early voting began today, and you have two choices for your next governor. The governor, a candidate who will sign and has been very clear that she supports legalizing adult use retail, Abigail Spanberger, former congresswoman. And then we have the current lieutenant governor, Winsome Earl-Sears, who has made some wild statements about cannabis and believes that it makes you kill people and is going to decimate society. So if you're not registered to vote in Virginia, there's still time. Get registered, update your voter registration, and you can start voting now. Please do. We have a great article covering this specific issue from our friends at Marijuana Moment. I'm going to share that with you all as well. And what I say in that is the choice is clear for Virginia voters. Abigail Spanberger supports legalizing and regulating cannabis sales for adults 21 and older. Winsome Earl Sears does not. So we had some Virginia news, some Minnesota news. In California, we have some really good news thanks to our fantastic California NORML chapter. State lawmakers sent a bill to Governor Newsom's desk that will halt a tax hike on cannabis products. Tell us a little bit more about that, Paul.
Sure. Kudos really goes out to our California NORML chapter. They spearheaded this legislation. They worked with Representative Haney to sponsor the bill, hold press conferences in favor of the bill, and really push this bill forward. So as many people know, in California, like in many adult use legal states, California is arguably overtaxed. Certainly when one looks at the tax burdens that are placed upon alcohol and tobacco products, they are minuscule compared to the tax burden that's currently placed on the retail sale of adult use cannabis products in California. And those taxes, unbelievably, recently got even higher. As of July 1st, the legislature increased the excise tax on cannabis products. I believe it went from 15% to 19%. California NORML worked to sponsor a bill and shepherd that bill through the legislature that rolls back that tax, that says, no, that increased tax is not going to take effect starting October 1. And in fact, it halts the legislature from further raising taxes for the next 3 years, I believe. That bill went to Governor Newsom. Newsom has been supportive of this effort, so we certainly are of the belief he's going to sign it, and that hopefully will roll back taxes and roll back prices in California and lead to lower prices for the consumers there.
Again, thank you, California NORML, for your significant work on this issue. Really looking forward to seeing Governor Newsom put pen to paper on that.
Yeah, and I would say we also, though, learned this week that in Michigan, certain Democrats in the legislature have expressed wanting to go along with the governor's proposal to increase an excise tax there by about 32%. So that is an issue we're opposing. If you live in Michigan, we have an action alert that you can send your lawmakers. And I believe about 800 or 900 folks who live in Michigan have done so. And I think we also have printable signs that folks can obtain there as well.
We do have printable signs for that. I was looking to see if I could find them in the... Here it is. It is on. I'm going to drop those in the comments for everyone right now. Here is the link to the action alert. And I'll drop a link to the printable sign as well. We've sent these to a number of dispensaries in Michigan, so you might see it there. But you can print this out and you can share this with everyone you know and love in Michigan. Insulin says, this is great. Why is it up to cannabis to make up for all these state budget shortfalls? It's, I don't know. Why is it up to cannabis to also solve capitalism? We're supposed to solve America's healthcare crisis, America's mental health care crisis with cannabis policy. We're just talking about weed here. It's not the savior of all that ails every state budget or legal consequence, really. Maryland, we saw some action this week as well, Paul. We saw the Appellate Court of Maryland uphold the state-imposed ban on hemp-derived intoxicants. Not the first state to do so. What do you think about that, Paul?
It's not surprising because, as you said, there are now a number of states that have made decisions to either significantly curtail the sale of these products or in some cases prohibit them altogether. Obviously, the industry that has grown up around the sale of these products is not happy with those decisions, and they have filed lawsuits in a number of these states. And for the most part, those suits haven't been successful. This one in Maryland before the appellate court also has not been successful. My guess is that it will be taken to the state Supreme Court. But essentially what the appellate court in this case said is that there was no history or no precedent for these products ever being legal, and that therefore there was no issue with the state passing legislation to make them illegal. And they also added that simply because that legislation hasn't been vigorously enforced did not in any way imply that the state did not think it was on valid legal ground for making those products illegal. It was just choosing, for whatever reason, not to enforce the law vigorously. But nonetheless, the court upheld the prohibition.
I am fairly certain that that challenge has been filed already in Maryland. It was an industry group that
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, the decision is really not very different than we've seen in courts in certain other jurisdictions. I know that there's a lower court in Alabama that upheld a similar prohibition. There's an appellate court ruling out of Virginia, and there's a district court ruling out of Alaska, and I believe there may be one out of Arkansas as well.
John, first of all, hi, John. Second, it's not going to be Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is not going to be the last state. I know Pennsylvania has had so much opportunity, and they keep getting bogged down in political nonsense instead. It's definitely not going to be the last state, though. What might be the last state is Idaho.
That I'd put my money on Idaho.
But Paul, Idaho also has that referendum.
Yes, they do.
Tell everyone about that.
Sure. So Idaho, for folks keeping score, earlier this year, Idaho lawmakers became the first state in the country to pass mandatory minimum sentencing for first-time low-level marijuana possession. Idaho lawmakers are of the opinion that their current prohibition wasn't harsh enough, and they needed to make it harsher. And lawmakers were upset that when first-time low-level marijuana offenders were going before judges in Idaho, that oftentimes the judges weren't throwing the book at them. So lawmakers said, well, we just want to take this out of the hands of judges altogether, and we're going to pass a mandatory minimum penalty. So they did that. But then they also passed a state-sponsored referendum that Idaho voters will decide on next November that asks voters to essentially abdicate the power that they have via Idaho's ballot initiative process, to willingly give up that power when it comes to deciding on marijuana policy or state policy with respect to any other controlled substance, and to give that power solely to the state legislature. So again, Idaho is asking voters this, if they vote yes, to say that voters can never decide on a marijuana-related initiative ever again, and that if there's any change in marijuana laws, it must be done by the Idaho legislature. That is arguably the most rabidly anti-marijuana constituency in the United States.
Can you imagine, as a voter, going into a voting booth and voting to remove your right to vote?
I can't. And for that reason, even in Idaho, I don't think this is going to fly.
I am very interested to see how much Idaho voters hate themselves and their ability to vote.
Yeah,
You know, while I don't think a legalization referendum prevails in Idaho anytime soon, it would be interesting to see both of those issues on the ballot during the same election.
Absolutely. And it tells you all you need to know about what Idaho lawmakers think of their own voters. they clearly know that they are promoting marijuana policies that are out of sync with how their voters think marijuana ought to be treated in Idaho. And they're terrified of voters being able at some point in the future to weigh in on this issue. So they want to take that right away from them.
It's just, I guess people vote again. Quinn said something that made me think about this, and voters step into the voting booth and vote against their own interests election after election after election. But this one is just so arguably in your face. I can't imagine, but also it's Idaho, so we'll all find out.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But for folks who are listening, that referendum is qualified. It is on the legislature. To get on the ballot, I believe they needed a 2/3 majority, and they got it. And it is it is set. It is on the legislature. They will be voting on it.
It's wild. What else did we see this week? You wrote a great piece about cannabis being effective for patients who are undergoing chemotherapy and have neuropathy. That's pain, numbness, tingling, like when you lay on your arm, whatever, and it goes to sleep. A really terrible version of that. And this study indicates that it's effective.
Yeah, it shouldn't surprise anyone. The strongest data we have, the sort of gold standard data as it pertains to clinical trials, shows that cannabis is effective to treat pain. And there's all sorts of different types of pain. And cannabis seems to be most effective at treating neuropathic pain. There's other types of pain that cannabis seems to be far less effective at treating, but neuropathy, cannabis seems to be especially effective at treating. And this is significant because opioids and many other traditional analgesics are not very effective at treating neuropathy. So there's a real need there. The study you're referring to came out of Israel. This was an observational clinical trial that was done. And for folks who may not know, Israel regulated medical marijuana access many, many years ago. It's a program through their health ministry. And I just learned earlier this week when I was at a conference, they had a speaker from Israel who was there. And he said currently there's about 150,000 patients that are receiving cannabis as a medicine by prescription through this program. And he said it is standard practice for oncologists and other clinicians when they have a patient who has been diagnosed with cancer, they begin that process of their treatment by prescribing cannabis.
That's amazing. I mean, that's really fantastic. I don't often talk about my own personal experiences as it relates to my work, but for those of you who don't know, I've had cancer twice. Not a fun experience at all. And I had peripheral neuropathy for the first time, and then the second time required a stem cell transplant and a whole lot of chemotherapy and a whole lot of hospitalization and a whole lot of peripheral neuropathy and effects that I still experience today, 15 years, nearly 16 years after my transplant. I still have neuropathy symptoms. And you're right, Paul, traditional medications are not effective. I was prescribed all sorts of weird things, failed epilepsy drugs, off-label prescribing of SSRIs that have some potential efficacy for neuropathy, and none of them worked for me. It was so I love that in Israel we're taking better care of people. That was it was the driving factor for me in getting involved with NORML, because I wanted to have better options. I wanted all Virginians to have better options here, and looks like fortunately we do now, and I can only hope that we can make that a reality for every American who needs access.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so frustrating because when we see some of these programs that have been up and running in other parts of the world, or just north of our own border in Canada, which legalized medical marijuana and has had a medical cannabis access program for about 26 years now. They did so decades before they legalized adult use access. We see how these programs benefit patients. We see the results from these programs. It is insulting when we hear lawmakers and others to this day continue to be skeptical or express skepticism when it comes to the medical utility of cannabis or the efficacy of cannabis. These countries would not have these programs up and running for decades if they weren't working, if cannabis wasn't safe and effective as a medicine.
Speaking of Canada, that was one of our stories this week is from Canada, and researchers looked at rates of suicidal ideation and attempts post legalization and found that there was no uptick.
Yeah, that probably doesn't surprise a lot of folks listening to this show, but if you do the sort of work that we do, you know that many of our opponents like to say that cannabis actually causes depression and makes depression worse and ultimately leads to suicides, and that the use of cannabis and the legalization of cannabis in states like Colorado is playing a role in increasing number of suicides. So the reason it's important for us to highlight data like this data coming out of Canada is to provide the evidence that says, no, this simply isn't true. Our opponents are simply either mischaracterizing or they're simply lying. So in Canada, where researchers have done quite a bit of work to see what are the outcomes of nationwide legalization. It's not like Canada legalized adult use cannabis in 2018 and then sort of walked away from it. They've been studying the outcomes of this policy change every step of the way, looking at impact on mental health, looking at impacts on car accidents, looking at teen use, changes in prescription drug usage, all sorts of things. So in this particular study, they looked at the total number of people showing up at the emergency departments because they're expressing suicidal ideation or they've had a suicide attempt. They looked at the period of time immediately following legalization. They then followed up through that same period of time 2 years later. And what they found was rates had remained stable during that time. And they also noted that alcohol is the number one drug that they find in toxicology screens of folks who are showing up to the hospitals because they've either attempted suicide or expressing thoughts of suicide. It wasn't marijuana, and the percentage with marijuana in their systems hadn't been increasing over time either. So again, it's basically showed a null effect.
And I think it's helpful we've talked about this before on the show a number of times, but for those of you who are doing this work in your own states, it's helpful to understand that people who have unmet mental health care needs use substances and are often more frequently polysubstance users. And the fact that somebody uses cannabis, that does not make it the causation of their mental health care needs.
Yes, we see this in patients with psychiatric illnesses all the time. They tend to use all sorts of controlled substances at far greater percentages than the general public, particularly nicotine. And I don't think there's a strong belief that smoking cigarettes causes mental illness, but we recognize that people with mental illnesses tend to smoke cigarettes. And that same relationship holds true with cannabis in many cases. And the motivations for use are largely the same. Many of these people are using nicotine to try to curb their anxiety. They're using cannabis for self-medication purposes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Correlation, not causation. And we have one last story for this week. That was about complex regional pain syndrome, and those patients are reporting improvements with cannabis use, which again is going to come as no surprise to anyone.
Yeah, but what I like about this study is anytime I get a chance to highlight what's going on in the United Kingdom when it comes to medical cannabis, I make a point to do so, because I don't think it's very well known that in both Australia and the UK, they have national medical cannabis access programs where patients can obtain prescription cannabis in the form of flower or in the form of extracts. And unlike in the United States, and unlike, frankly, in the majority of states that have had medical cannabis programs, in the UK and in Australia, they have patient registries that researchers are able to data mine and do so with great frequency. So what happens is researchers in the United Kingdom, they do this in Australia as well. They select specific patient cohorts, patients suffering from insomnia that are in the UK registry, patients with epilepsy that are registered in the registry, patients with IBD, Crohn's disease, cancer, traumatic brain injury, you name it. They look at these different patient cohorts and they select several hundred of them, and they assess their symptoms at baseline when they enter the registry before they're using medical cannabis. And then they test their symptoms a month afterward, 3 months afterward, 6 months afterward, 12 months afterward, 2 years afterward. They want to see if these patients' symptoms are improving as they're using cannabis, and if those improvements are sustained over extended periods of time. And we now have this observational data from both of these countries involving tens of thousands of patients in dozens and dozens of patient cohorts that show consistently that patients that are using these products in these programs, that it is safe for them to use these products, and that those products are effective. They're mitigating their symptoms. They're mitigating their use of other traditional prescriptions, and those benefits are sustainable. Usually the benefits are almost immediate. We see reduced symptoms by month 1. But to me, what's more important is we see consistently that they maintain that relief for extended periods of time. So in other words, at month 12, these patients are still receiving benefits from medical cannabis. At month 18, they're still receiving benefits. They're not becoming tolerant to the therapeutic effects of medical cannabis. I think it's very, very powerful data when you look at it in its totality. And if folks want to go ahead and read that story, you'll see at the end of it, I reference all the other different patient populations that have been assessed through those registries. And it's becoming a very exhaustive list now.
Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a little bit of event news that I'm going to share with folks, but just want to take a minute to say thank you. Appreciate you joining us and sharing your thoughts on rescheduling.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I hope everybody has a great weekend, and I'll be back soon.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
All right, friends, there's still a few minutes to get in any burning questions you might have. I want to let you all know that this show is now going to be available on Spotify. You can find NORML on Spotify, and you can find Live with NORML on Spotify as well. This show gets uploaded after we do the live stream, so you can listen or watch Live from NORML on Spotify. Now, in addition to the playback option that's on YouTube and on Facebook. And of course, we love when you all join us live so that we can talk to you and answer all of your questions. We have some events coming up that I don't want you all to miss. In fact, tonight, September 19th, tonight at 9 p.m., our Lehigh Valley NORML chapter is hosting a screening of Up in Smoke. Classic, isn't it? Let me drop a link in the chat for you all now. Again, this is Lehigh Valley NORML in Pennsylvania. They're hosting a screening of Up in Smoke at 9 p.m. tonight at the Gap Theater. Scroll up to see the ticketing link. Now, next week, almost next week, however time works, September 27th, Kentucky NORML has been traversing the state, doing patient registration fairs for their new statewide medical cannabis program. Huge shout out to Kentucky NORML for their work on this issue, making sure that patients are able to get access, get certified. And here we go. September 27th from 10 to 3 at the Paducah-McCracken County Convention Center. And let me drop, oh, the link is in there as well. You'll see that Zeffy.com link a little bit above this. Nick, sorry you're going to miss that movie. I'm sure Jeff will miss you as well. And then coming up in December is the NORML Key West Legal Seminar. This is December 4 through 6 at the Hyatt Centric Key West. You can get tickets to that at norml.org/Key West. If you're an attorney and you need CLEs, great, we've got you covered because our legal seminars are fully accredited in every state that requires continuing legal education for practicing attorneys. If you don't need that credit or you're not an attorney, we have a discounted rate for you. Even if you're not an attorney, this is still a great opportunity to connect with people from across the country who are renowned legal experts on cannabis as we work our way from marijuana prohibition to cannabis freedom. So everyone come on out and see us in Key West. Richard, I see your comment about elections in Michigan. Tell me more and I'll talk about it. Actually, let's go ahead and let me get you the Smoke the Vote link, friends, for everything. There are elections underway around the country. And I'll just tell you what they are because I have that opportunity right here. Thank you for the reminder, Richard. We have a special election on the 23rd in Georgia. In Arizona, there's a special election on the 23rd. In Florida, there's a special election on the 30th. Moving into October, South Carolina has a special election on the 21st. Alabama has a special election on the 28th. And then looking forward to November, New Hampshire has a special election on the 4th. Texas has a special on the 4th. So does Minnesota. So does Mississippi. And so does Washington. This is cut off. Where is, oh, it skipped a few. Tennessee also has a special on October 7th. And Virginia general election is November 4th. New Hampshire also has a special on November 4th. I couldn't see those. They were cut off. Sorry. But wherever you are, if you head to vote.norml.org, put in your address, you will be able to see what elections are pending in your state and where the candidates stand on cannabis policy. Remember, if you elect people who are terrible on cannabis policy, then you will get terrible cannabis policies. It's up to us to make sure that we're informed voters and that we're also helping our friends, our family, our neighbors, our community be informed voters, make sure they know to get registered, to get to the polls, and how to research their candidates. And for us, of course, we want them to know where the candidates stand on cannabis policy. And you can find that out at vote.norml.org. Did we do it all? Where can we send information about our... Richard, you can email anything to norml@norml.org. It's a real email address. I really see it. You can send it anytime you want. Hey, Brady, good to see you. Thanks for being here. Thanks to everyone for being here. Melissa, thank you for sharing. Is it going to let me copy this? Of course it's not. Melissa did drop a comment in there about our show. I'm going to see if I can grab it real quick. Grab a link to that Spotify. We also have a Substack. So if you're a Substack user, please go ahead and follow us there as well. Let's see if I can get, there we go. Thank you for sharing that, Melissa. I wish it would let me copy the link, but it won't. Copy link to podcast. Here we go. So I'm going to drop this link in the chat right now for the podcast on Spotify. Of course, please just go ahead and follow us as normal and the podcast. And if you love it, give us a good rating, please. And let's see, can we get a Substack as well? That'd be great. Let's see. No, in fact, does not want to find us on Substack. Let's see if I can find it this way. Oh, no, thank you. It wants me to do all kinds of things. You can find us there yourself. What else, friends? Brady, I see your question. Yes, Quinn, NORML is on Blue Sky. Thank you for asking. I believe I added a link. Maybe not to the, no, Blue Sky's on the, in the header on the NORML website, we have our Facebook, our YouTube, our Instagram, our Twitter, and our LinkedIn. We don't have our Blue Sky up there because there wasn't a widget for it, but I am going to grab that for you right now. I don't know if Tom has a Substack. I don't know if Marijuana Moment has a Substack. That's a great question. Oh. How interesting. Perfect. Thank you, Quinn. We are following you. I love it. All right, friends, this has been great. This has been fantastic. Brady, no, I'm not going to do a 2-hour show. We started late because the interwebs were broken. But can I recommend my favorite cannabis picks to you? Well, you're in Georgia, so no. But really, wherever you are in the country, my recommendation to you, my favorite type of cannabis is legal cannabis. Always. This has been great, friends. I hope that you will join us back here next time. So wherever you're watching, go ahead and hit that like, follow, or subscribe button so you never miss when NORML goes live, and give us the opportunity to answer your burning questions. I'm J.M. Pedini. I'm the Development Director here at the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And as always, I'll see you right back here next time. Bye-bye.